every root in the greenhouse turned overnight. Not toward water, not toward light, toward the door we walk through. All of them. Every single root mass in Greenhouse 4 had reoriented between Friday close and Monday morning. Not gradually, not the way roots drift over a growing season. They turned like something with a neck, pointed at the exact spot where we enter the building every day. And by the time we noticed, they'd already been growing in our direction for weeks. My name is Elliot Bryce. I was a crop systems technician at Loxley Agricultural Research Station in Homestead, Florida, about 40 minutes south of Miami, right in the middle of what locals call the Redland. If you've driven down past Florida City on US 1 heading for the Keys, you've been close. Flat farmland, limestone underneath, humidity that sticks to you by 7 in the morning. The station sat on about 12 acres, most of it covered in linked greenhouse structures, the kind with corrugated polycarbonate panels and automated climate systems. We grew experimental cultivars for heat resistance, mostly tomatoes and peppers, some ornamentals, government-adjacent funding, university partnerships, nothing secret, nothing exciting. At least that's what I thought for the first 14 months I worked there. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a scientist. I don't have a biology degree or a background in botany. I was the guy who monitored the drip irrigation schedules and made sure the ventilation fans kicked on at the right temperatures. I fixed things. I replaced grow bulbs and cleaned condensation off sensors. I was good at my job precisely because I paid attention to small details, and that's probably why I noticed what was happening before anyone else did. At first, we thought it was just one section, one batch of roots behaving strangely in one corner of one greenhouse, but when we checked the other beds, they were all doing it, growing in different directions, not random though. Each section was oriented toward a different spot, the spots where each of us had been working that week. That should have been the warning, but we didn't understand it yet. It started in April. The growing season down there doesn't really stop, but April is when the heat and humidity start climbing toward miserable, and the greenhouses were running at about 91 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Greenhouse 4 was our largest structure, maybe 200 feet long and 80 feet wide, with rows of raised beds running lengthwise. We'd planted a new batch of hybrid tomato rootstock about 6 weeks earlier, and by April the root systems were well established. I was in there replacing a failed humidity sensor near the back wall when I noticed the roots. Now, roots grow toward water. That's what they do. It's called hydrotropism, and it's one of the most basic plant behaviors there is. Our drip lines ran along each bed on the east side, so you'd expect root growth trending east. But the roots I was looking at near the back corner were growing west. All of them. And the drip lines were dry on that side. There was no water source to the west. There was nothing to the west except the aisle where I'd been kneeling for the past 20 minutes. I mentioned it to Dana Park, our lead researcher. She came out, looked at it, and said it was probably a moisture gradient issue. Maybe condensation was pooling on the floor near the wall. She told me to check the drainage and moved on. I checked the drainage. It was fine. The floor was dry. But I let it go because she had a PhD and I didn't, and that's how things work. A week later, I couldn't let it go anymore. I'd been doing my morning walkthrough in Greenhouse 4, the same route I always took, left to right along the center aisle, then doubling back along the east wall. Took about 15 minutes. When I came back through the center aisle on the return pass, I stopped. I couldn't say exactly what was different at first. It was a feeling more than an observation. The tomato plants on either side of the aisle looked closer. Not dramatically, not enough that someone walking through casually would notice. But I'd walked that same aisle 20 minutes earlier, and the gap felt tighter. I got a tape measure from the supply room. Center aisle, Greenhouse 4, 44 inches. That's what it was supposed to be. I measured it in 3 spots, 44, 43, 43 and a half, all within tolerance, nothing weird. But then I measured again at the end of my shift, 6 hours later, same 3 spots, 43, 42 and a quarter, 42. I wrote it down, and I started measuring every day. Looking back, that was the first real sign. Not the roots, not the feeling, the numbers. The numbers didn't lie. Over the next 2 weeks, I kept a notebook. The aisle widths in greenhouse 4 were shrinking, not uniformly, not everywhere, specifically in the areas where people spent the most time. The center aisle, which was our main foot traffic corridor, lost about 1.5 inches over 10 days. The back corner where I'd first noticed the root anomaly had narrowed by almost 3 inches, and that was the spot where I'd been kneeling for extended periods doing sensor work. The east side service aisle, which almost nobody used because the equipment racks were all on the west side, hadn't changed at all. It wasn't just getting smaller, it was getting smaller where we stood the longest. I showed the notebook to Dana. She stared at it for a while and then asked if I was sure about my measurements. I told her I was using the same tape measure, same spots marked with a paint pen on the bed frames, same time each day. She didn't say anything for about 10 seconds, and then she said, "That's just vigorous growth, Elliot. These hybrids are bred for aggressive root expansion. If they're growing a little faster than projected, that's actually a good result." I asked her why they were growing faster only where people stood. She didn't answer that. She just said she'd look into it and went back to her office in the admin building. The thing about working in greenhouses in South Florida is that you develop a kind of spatial memory. You know the layout with your eyes closed. You know which rows have the taller plants, where the hose bibs are, which panels let in more light in the afternoon. You move through those structures dozens of times a day, and your body memorizes the space like a driver memorizes the route to work. So when the space starts changing, even a little, you feel it before you see it. By the 3rd week of April, I felt it constantly. The sensation was hard to describe to people who weren't in there every day. It was like the greenhouse was slowly exhaling, getting closer on all sides, just barely, just enough that you'd reach for something and it was 1/2 inch closer than you expected. Or you'd step between 2 rows and your shoulders would brush leaves that hadn't been there yesterday. It never happened while you were watching. That was the thing that got to me early on. I'd stare at a row for 5 minutes and nothing moved. But I'd turn around, walk to the other end, come back, and swear something had shifted. That should have been enough to make us leave. It wasn't. Marcus Cole noticed it too. Marcus was our other full-time tech, a big guy from Cutler Bay who'd been at Loxley for 6 years. He didn't say anything scientific about it. What he said was, "G4 is getting tight, man. I'm catching my shirt on stuff that wasn't there last week." I showed him my notebook and he read through it slowly and then looked at me like I'd told him something he already knew but hadn't wanted to say out loud. We started measuring together. 2 tape measures, 2 people, same spots, 3 times a day. Morning, midday, end of shift. And the pattern became undeniable over the next 4 days. The aisles were narrower after high traffic periods. After lunch, when the greenhouse had been empty for 45 minutes, the measurements would hold or sometimes even relax back by a fraction. But by end of shift, after a full day of people walking through, measuring, watering, checking plants, the aisles would have closed in again. Marcus put it in a way that stuck with me. He said it was like the plants were breathing in when we were around and forgetting to breathe back out. We brought our data to Dana again, and this time we also brought Ramon Gutierrez, who was a part-time grad student working on his thesis about root phenotyping. Ramon was quiet, methodical, careful with his words. He looked at our numbers and then went into Greenhouse 4 alone with a root imaging camera, one of those handheld scanners that can map subsurface root architecture without digging anything up. He was in there for 3 hours. When he came out, he was pale, which is saying something because Ramon was Dominican and not a guy who scared easily. He sat down at the table in the break room and put his laptop in front of us and pulled up the root scans. The roots weren't just growing toward the aisles, they were networking. Below the soil line, the root systems of adjacent plants had fused together in dense mats, and those mats were extending laterally toward the areas of highest foot traffic. The root density directly beneath the center aisle was 4 to 5 times higher than the root density beneath the beds themselves. The plants were literally building infrastructure under our feet. The roots weren't spreading evenly, they were densest exactly where we walked. Ramon said he'd never seen anything like it. He started explaining something about mycorrhizal networks, fungal threads that connect root systems underground. Tropical species do this sometimes. But about halfway through, he just stopped talking. He stared at the screen for a long moment and then closed his laptop. Because what we were looking at didn't behave like anything he'd studied. The roots were growing in coordinated patterns, forming what he called directional mats that pointed consistently toward the paths where humans walked. And he didn't have a word for that. Dana finally took it seriously, or at least she stopped dismissing it. She put in a request to the university partner, UF Tropical Agriculture, for additional analysis equipment. She told us to keep measuring, but to also start a more structured observation protocol. She wanted time-lapse cameras in the greenhouse, motion sensors, soil moisture probes at multiple depths. She wanted data. We got the cameras set up by the end of April, 6 units mounted high on the greenhouse frame, covering the full length of the interior. They shot one frame every 30 seconds, 24/7. Marcus and I reviewed the first week of footage on a rainy Tuesday morning in May, fast-forwarding through hours of nothing. And then we saw it. At normal speed, you couldn't tell anything was happening. The plants looked still, the way plants always look still. But sped up to about 200 times, everything changed. The time-lapse showed the tomato plants along the center aisle leaning slowly, fractionally during the hours when workers were present. They weren't just growing toward the light or toward water. They were growing toward the aisle. During the day, when people were walking through, the lean was consistent and directional. At night, when the greenhouse was empty, the lean stopped. Some of the plants partially straightened. By morning, you almost couldn't tell, but they never fully went back. Every day, the lean got a little more pronounced, a little more permanent. The plants were ratcheting closer, shift by shift, growing in our direction during the day, holding position overnight, then growing more the next day. They didn't move while we were watching, only after we left. That was the part that got under my skin. Marcus rewound one segment and played it 3 times. It showed a 6-hour stretch from the previous Thursday when I'd been doing maintenance on a drip valve near row 12. The plants in rows 11 and 13 had leaned toward my position, not toward the light overhead, not toward each other, toward me. When I left and walked to the other end of the greenhouse, you could see a faint wave of movement follow my path, delayed by maybe 40 minutes, like the plants were responding to where I'd been, not where I was, tracking on a delay. He paused the video and looked at me and said, "That's not right." No, it wasn't. May got worse in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who didn't spend their days inside those walls. The data was clear, and even Dana had stopped pretending it was normal growth patterns. But the nature of the problem was so gradual that from the outside, it sounded almost boring. Plants growing a little faster near people, root networks getting denser under walkways. It sounded like something you'd read about in a journal article, not something that would make you start dreading your morning shift. But we were in there every day, and the feeling had changed. Greenhouse 4 used to feel open. High ceiling, wide aisles, good light. By mid-May, it felt like walking into a room where someone had moved all the furniture 2 inches closer together. You could still navigate. You could still do your job. But the proportions were wrong, and your body knew it, even when your eyes couldn't quite pin down why. I started bumping into things, reaching for tools on shelves and finding leaves in the way that I was sure hadn't been there the day before. My shoulders brushed foliage constantly. And the smell changed. Greenhouses always smell green, that wet chlorophyll scent mixed with soil and fertilizer. But there was something else now, something underneath. A faint sweetness, like overripe fruit, but not quite. More like the smell you get from a wound on a tree trunk where the sap is leaking. Alive, but raw. I noticed it most in the areas where the growth was densest, along the center aisle and in the back corners where I'd done the most work. Ramon started spending more time in there. He was excited in the way grad students get when they think they've found something publishable. He'd set up additional root imaging stations and was taking scans every 12 hours. His data was getting stranger. The root mats beneath the center aisle had doubled in density since his first scan. And they weren't just growing laterally anymore. They were growing up. The roots were pushing toward the surface directly beneath the most trafficked areas, getting closer to the topsoil, closer to our footsteps. He found something else too. The root mats had a structure to them, not random tangles. Organized lattices, almost geometric, with thicker primary roots forming what looked like channels, and thinner secondary roots branching off in regular intervals. He showed us images that looked like satellite photos of river deltas. It was beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what it meant. I asked him what he thought was driving it. He said he honestly didn't know. There was no known tropism that responded specifically to human presence. Roots respond to water, gravity, light, touch, and certain chemical gradients. They don't respond to a person standing nearby. But he had one theory, and he said it carefully, like he didn't want it to be true. He thought the plants were detecting us. The chemicals our skin releases, the CO2 we exhale, our body heat. He thought they were smelling us, growing toward our scent, tracking us the way a predator might follow a trail, except at plant speed, hour by hour, day by day. That's when it got worse. Not the situation. The situation had been getting worse for weeks. I mean the feeling of knowing what it meant. I think that was the first night I didn't sleep well. We thought it was just reacting to us. A strange biological response, sure, but still a reaction. Stimulus and response, cause and effect. We were wrong. But we wouldn't understand how wrong for another 6 weeks. The second week of May, we got our first visit from UF. Dr. Annalisa Vogt, plant physiologist, drove down from Gainesville with 2 graduate assistants and enough equipment to fill the bed of a pickup. She was businesslike, skeptical, and clearly treated the whole thing as a curiosity rather than a concern. She spent 2 days running tests, VOC sensors in the aisles, phytochrome assays on the leaf tissue, hormone panels on the root samples. She watched the time-lapse footage and raised her eyebrows but didn't say much. On her second evening, she asked me to do something that seemed odd. She wanted me to stand in one spot in greenhouse 4 for 30 minutes without moving, then leave and not come back for 12 hours. She set up cameras and root imaging equipment around my position. I stood there, feeling ridiculous, sweating in the 90-degree heat, while the plants around me did absolutely nothing visible. The imaging data told a different story. In the 30 minutes I stood there, the root network beneath my feet had extended laterally by 6 centimeters, toward me from all directions, like something reaching up through dark water. Dr. Vogt left the next morning. She said she'd be back with more equipment and more people. She told Dana to keep recording everything and to limit time spent in greenhouse 4 to essential maintenance only. She didn't explain why she thought that was necessary, and none of us pushed her on it because I think we all already understood. The problem was, essential maintenance in a working greenhouse is a lot of time. You can't just stop watering and checking on experimental crops. Someone had to be in there every day. And every day, the greenhouse was a little different than the day before. And that's when we made a mistake. We thought being careful would be enough. We thought we were the ones in control of how much time we spent in there. By the end of May, the aisles in greenhouse 4 had narrowed enough that you couldn't walk 2 abreast in most places. Plants that had been in neat rows were sending shoots laterally into the walkways, not randomly, The chutes extended primarily into the paths that saw the most use. Service aisles that we rarely walked were almost unchanged. The center aisle, which all four of us used multiple times daily, was becoming a corridor of green. You had to turn sideways in 2 spots near the middle. And something new had started. The plants nearest the main entrance had developed a lean toward the door. Not toward light, not toward the ventilation intake. Toward the exact point where we entered and exited. I noticed it on a Saturday when I came in for a short check, and the greenhouse had been empty since Friday evening. 16 hours with no human presence, and the entrance side plants were still canted forward, reaching toward the door like they were waiting. That was the last normal week we had. Marcus said something that weekend that I've thought about a lot since. We were outside hosing off tools, and he said, "You know what it reminds me of? You know those time lapses of vines growing up a trellis? How they reach out and feel around until they find something to grab. That's what G4 is doing. Except the trellis is us." I told him that was the worst thing he could have said. He laughed. He wouldn't be laughing by June. Something happened in the last week of May that I didn't put in the notebook at the time. I think I didn't want it written down, didn't want to look at it. I walked into an aisle I'd used every day for over a year, row 6 to row 7, east side. I could have walked it blindfolded. I turned the corner from the center aisle and it didn't lead anywhere. Just plants. Solid green, waist high, filling the space from bed to bed, like it had never been a path. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I walked around to the other end of the same row and looked in from the opposite direction. Open, completely passable from that side, narrowing only in the last few feet toward where I'd been standing. The aisle was clear everywhere except where I was trying to enter it. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself I'd misremembered which row it was. I knew I hadn't. The first real scare happened on June 3rd. I remember the date because I wrote it in the notebook in block letters and underlined it twice. Ramon had been in the back section of Greenhouse 4 for about 2 hours doing root scans. He was focused, working methodically, the way he always did. He'd set up his equipment in the narrow space between rows 18 and 19 and had been kneeling in the same spot for most of that time. I was in the front section doing irrigation checks and could see him through the canopy, though the view was getting harder as the plants grew denser. He called out to me, not loud, not panicked, just, "Hey Elliot, can you come here a second?" I walked back to him. Took about a minute, and when I got to rows 18 and 19, I stopped. The aisle where Ramon was kneeling had closed to about 16 inches. He was hemmed in on both sides by foliage so thick I could barely see his shoulders. The plants had leaned in above him, forming a canopy over his position. He was essentially inside a green tunnel that had not existed 2 hours earlier when he'd set up. He looked up at me and his face was completely still, the way people get when they're working very hard to stay calm. He said, "I can't get my equipment out. The root scanner is wedged." I looked. The lateral shoots from both rows had extended into the aisle at ground level. Not just leaves, but actual woody stems, thicker than I expected. They'd grown in around his scanner case and his power cable. Not tangled exactly, more like settled, like a hand resting on an object it doesn't intend to let go of. We spent 20 minutes cutting him out with pruning shears. The stems were green and flexible but dense. When I cut them, they oozed a thick sap that smelled like that same sweet, raw scent I'd been noticing for weeks, except concentrated. It got on my gloves and took 3 washes to come off. After we got Ramon out and moved his equipment to the front of the greenhouse, he sat on an overturned bucket and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "It wasn't growing toward me, it was growing around me. There's a difference. Toward is pursuit. Around is containment." We didn't go back to rows 18 and 19 for the rest of the day. The next morning, I went in alone before anyone else arrived and looked at the spot where Ramon had been working. The aisle was open again, not as wide as it used to be, but navigable. The lateral chutes were still there, but they'd relaxed, pulled back slightly, as if whatever tension had been driving them forward had eased overnight. But the root imaging station Ramon had left behind, the one we hadn't been able to pull out the day before, was now sitting neatly in the center of the aisle. The stems that had been wrapped around it had retracted. The scanner was undamaged, sitting there like someone had tidied up. I didn't tell the others about that last part for 2 days. I didn't have an explanation, and I didn't want to hear anyone else try to come up with one. June moved fast, and the situation in Greenhouse 4 accelerated in ways that forced us to change how we worked. Dana implemented a new protocol: nobody in G4 alone, minimum 2 people at all times, maximum 90 minutes per visit. She didn't call it a safety protocol because that would have meant filing paperwork and involving the station director. And nobody wanted to explain to administration that our tomato plants were behaving like they had intent. She just called it revised access scheduling and left it at that. The buddy system helped with the fear, but made the growth problem worse. 2 people in the greenhouse meant more biological signal, more heat, more CO2, more VOCs. The plants responded accordingly. Within a week of the new protocol, the growth rate in G4 visibly increased. Not just in the aisles, the canopy was filling in overhead, blocking more of the artificial light. The temperature inside rose because the ventilation fans were partially occluded by growth. The humidity spiked. It felt tropical in there, genuinely tropical, like stepping into a Florida hammock forest. Everything we did to protect ourselves made it stronger. We just didn't realize it yet. And the patterns evolved. In the early weeks, the growth had been directional but simple. Plants grew toward people, roots extended toward footsteps. Basic, consistent, one-dimensional tracking. By mid-June, it was more complicated. The plants seemed to be anticipating our movements. Here's what I mean. We always entered through the main door on the north end. We always walked the center aisle first, then branched out to our assigned rows. The plants along our habitual route had adapted. They'd pulled back slightly from the center aisle, creating just enough clearance for us to walk comfortably, while the lateral aisles had grown denser. It felt like being given a path, a designated corridor. The first time I noticed it, I thought maybe the foot traffic was actually suppressing growth directly underfoot. Made sense mechanically, right? We're walking on the soil, compacting it, maybe damaging fine roots. But then I tried walking a different route. I entered through the south emergency exit, which we never used, and walked an aisle we hadn't been in for days. That aisle was wide open, plenty of room. I walked it for about 10 minutes, checking plants, pretending nothing was unusual. When I came back through 20 minutes later to leave, the aisle had narrowed by 3 inches on both sides. 20 minutes, 3 inches per side. In April, that kind of growth had taken a week. The greenhouse was learning our patterns and adapting faster. And when we deviated from the pattern, it adjusted. Not instantly, but fast. Fast enough that within a single work session you could feel the space reshaping around you. Marcus made the observation that scared me most. He said, "The roots they give us keep getting longer." He was right. The easy path through the center aisle now curved slightly, following the open space between the encroaching plant walls. Where it used to be a straight shot from the north door to the back wall, it now bent gently to the left around row 9, and then back to the right around row 14. If you followed the open space, you walked maybe 20 extra feet. Not much, but the fact that the path existed, that it had been shaped by differential growth to guide our movement, was something I couldn't stop thinking about. We were being herded, gently, slowly, imperceptibly, but herded. I started mapping it. I got a roll of butcher paper and drew the greenhouse layout to scale, marking the aisle widths each day. Over 2 weeks, the map showed the corridors opening and closing like the chambers of a slow heart. The main route stayed passable but got longer and more winding. Dead ends appeared where there had been throughways. Alternative exits became harder to reach because the growth along those paths was thickest where we walked least. Marcus looked at my map one afternoon and said quietly, "It's building a maze." That's not quite what it was doing, but I understood what he meant. The structure of the space was becoming more complex, less predictable, and always oriented around our behavior. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaos, it was organization, and we were the organizing principle. Doctor. Vogt came back in the third week of June with a team of 5. They brought portable gas chromatographs, thermal imaging equipment, and a ground-penetrating radar unit. They were in the greenhouse for less than 4 hours before the radar operator, a postdoc named James, came out and asked to speak to Dana privately. I was close enough to hear most of it through the office door. The root network beneath Greenhouse 4 was no longer confined to the raised beds. It had extended beyond the bed walls, beneath the concrete aisle floors, under the foundation slab, and out into the surrounding soil. The root mass beneath the greenhouse was, by James's estimate, at least 3 times the mass of the visible plants above ground, and it was structured. The radar images showed layers, dense root lattices at the surface, thinner networks below, and at the deepest level, about 4 feet down, thick primary roots radiating outward from the center of the greenhouse like spokes on a wheel. The center of the greenhouse, where people walked most. James said the root structure resembled a neural network. He said that carefully, like he knew how it sounded. He said the branching patterns and the density distribution looked more like brain tissue than root tissue. He wasn't claiming the plants were thinking. He was saying the physical architecture of their underground growth matched patterns associated with information processing systems. Dr. Vogt pulled her team out by the end of that day. She told Dana she was recommending the greenhouse be shut down and the plants destroyed. She said she needed to consult with colleagues and would be in touch. She was in touch. She called every day for a week, asking about measurements and photos. Then she stopped calling. I've thought about that silence a lot. A plant physiologist who drove 4 hours to see something unprecedented, who pulled her entire team out in one afternoon, who called every single day for a week. And then nothing. I still don't know what she found in her data that made her go quiet. I'm not sure I want to. We didn't shut down the greenhouse. The station director, a bureaucrat named Heller, who spent most of his time in the main office building and had set foot in G4 maybe twice in 2 years, rejected the recommendation. He said destroying an active experimental crop required approval from the funding bodies, and he wasn't going to panic over what he called vigorous hybrid performance. He sent an email to Dana that said, essentially, keep monitoring and don't overreact. Dana printed the email and taped it to the break room wall. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. Late June. The 4th of July was coming and the station was operating on a skeleton crew. Most of the part-time staff had the week off. It was just me, Marcus, Dana, and Ramon. And Ramon was spending more time at UF writing up his findings than he was on site. For 3 days, it was really just the 3 of us. Those were the days when I understood what was happening in a way that data and measurements couldn't capture. When the greenhouse was lightly staffed, when only 2 or 3 of us were going in and out instead of 8 or 10, the growth behaved differently. It was more focused. In the busy weeks, the plants had spread their response across the whole structure, widening the growth pattern to cover all the areas where people moved. With fewer bodies, the growth concentrated. It tracked us individually. I noticed it on a Wednesday morning. I'd gone into G4 alone, violating Dana's protocol because she was on a phone call and Marcus was running late. I walked the center aisle to check a sensor at the back wall. Round trip, maybe 12 minutes. When I came back and looked at the time-lapse footage from that morning, I could see it clearly. The plants along my exact path had leaned inward after I passed. Not all the plants in the greenhouse, just the ones I walked past. A corridor of movement following me like a shadow cast in green. When Marcus arrived and went in, it happened to him separately. His root, his shadow, two trails of growth, intersecting where our paths crossed, independent everywhere else. The greenhouse was tracking us as individuals. That night I stayed late reviewing the full time-lapse archive. I went back through 3 weeks of footage and watched it at high speed, letting my eyes relax and just taking in the overall movement. And I saw something I'd missed before. The growth wasn't just reactive, it was predictive. No, that's not the right word. It wasn't predicting us. It was remembering us and building around that memory. On days when we followed our usual routine, the path would begin to open slightly before we arrived. Not much. Maybe half an inch of clearance appearing in the center aisle in the 20 minutes before our typical arrival time. The greenhouse had learned our schedule. It was preparing for us, getting ready. That's the part I still can't shake. Not that it tracked us, that it expected us. And on the 2 occasions during that period when we'd arrived at unusual times, the path had been narrower than expected, as though the greenhouse hadn't been ready for us, had been caught in some intermediate state. Like we'd walked in on something we weren't supposed to see. I sat in the dark break room watching footage on my laptop and felt cold despite the heat. The greenhouse wasn't just responding to us. It was modeling us. Our routes, our schedules, our patterns. It was building some kind of internal representation of how we moved through the space. And it was using that model to optimize its growth in ways I couldn't fully understand but could feel every time I walked through those narrowing aisles. July 4th, Independence Day. I remember thinking that was funny in a way that wasn't funny at all. I came in early because the automated watering system had thrown an error code overnight. Nobody else was on site. It was just me, the greenhouses, and about 10,000 plants. The holiday meant the campus was deserted. Even the security guard at the front gate wasn't there. Greenhouse 4 was silent. I stood outside the north door and looked through the polycarbonate panels, and I could see the interior was different. The time-lapse cameras would show what happened overnight, but I was seeing it in real time. The plants had rearranged. Not dramatically. Not like a time-lapse of a growing vine sped up to visible motion. It was structural. The central corridor had shifted. It now curved more than it used to, bending in an S shape that made it impossible to see from one end to the other. Lateral chutes had extended across 2 of the 3 emergency exits, not blocking them completely, but making them less obvious, less inviting. The entrance I was standing at was the only unobstructed way in, and the plants nearest the door were leaning toward me again, not toward the light which was overhead, not toward the ventilation intake which was on the east wall, toward me where I stood on the other side of a polycarbonate wall. I went in anyway because the irrigation system needed to be fixed and the experimental crops would be damaged if they went unwatered for another 12 hours. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself plants can't hurt you by growing. The fix took 40 minutes. A stuck solenoid valve on the main line, easy repair. I worked fast, kept my head down, didn't wander. Stayed on the center aisle, didn't touch anything I didn't need to. The greenhouse was quiet and warm, and the air was thick with that sweet sap smell, stronger than ever. When I finished and turned to leave, the aisle behind me was different than when I'd come in. Not closed, not blocked, but narrower, and the S-curve was tighter. The path back to the door was longer than the path I'd taken going in. I was certain of it. I walked out. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I didn't, because something told me that moving faster would just give it more information. When I got outside and turned around to look back through the panels, I could swear the lean of the plants near the entrance had increased in the 40 minutes I'd been inside. They were closer to the door now. I need to stop here and lay something out, because what I'm about to describe is the part where it stopped being strange and started being something else entirely. I started reviewing everything we knew, trying to organize it into something I could reason about. The patterns we'd observed had a logic to them, even if the mechanism was unknown. I wrote them down in the notebook, not as rules exactly, but as behaviors. Things we'd figured out through observation and measurement over the past 3 months. Plants in Greenhouse 4 grew toward human presence. This was consistent and reproducible. The response was proportional. Longer presence meant more growth. Higher body count meant faster growth. The tracking was directional. Growth oriented toward where a person was or had recently been. The response had a delay. Roughly 20 to 40 minutes after a person occupied a space, the surrounding plants would begin redirecting growth toward that location. The delay was getting shorter over time. Root networks expanded beneath high traffic areas and formed structured, interconnected mats. The root architecture resembled organized information processing systems. Growth followed individuals. Different people's paths generated independent growth responses. Stillness was complicated. Standing still in one spot for extended periods triggered intense, focused growth around that position, as Ramon had discovered. But very brief stillness, like pausing for a few seconds, seemed to reduce the response compared to walking. The plants tracked movement more aggressively than they tracked stationary presence, up to a point. After about 15 minutes of remaining in one place, the growth response accelerated dramatically. The greenhouse's spatial layout was being restructured by differential growth patterns. Paths opened where we walked regularly and closed where we didn't. The restructuring created longer routes and reduced exit options. The plants appeared to predict routine behavior. Growth patterns preemptively adjusted in advance of our typical schedules. Overnight, without human presence, growth slowed but did not reverse. Each day started slightly worse than the one before. I stared at that list and tried to think of it as a biology problem. A tropism, a response to stimuli like any other plant behavior, just faster and more complex than anything documented. That's how Ramon saw it. That's how Dr. Vogt probably saw it before she stopped returning calls. But the list didn't read like biology. It read like strategy. And we were already too late to do anything about it. The second week of July, things happened fast. Marcus and I went into Greenhouse 4 on a Tuesday for routine maintenance. We'd been in there maybe 30 minutes, working in different sections. I was near the front, he was in the back, and we were communicating by shouting over the increasingly dense canopy between us. At some point I realized I couldn't see him anymore. Not because he'd moved to a hidden spot, because the canopy had filled in to the point where visibility beyond about 15 feet was gone. I called out to him. He answered. He sounded fine. I asked him to start heading toward the front so we could leave together. He said, okay. It took him 25 minutes to reach me. The trip should have taken 3. He came out of the green looking confused and breathing hard. He said the aisles kept dead-ending. He'd turn down a row that he knew connected to the center aisle and find it choked with growth. He'd backtrack and try another route and find the same thing. The open paths kept leading him sideways, parallel to the long axis of the greenhouse, instead of toward the front where the exit was. He said it felt like being in a hedge maze, except the hedges were rearranging while he walked. I asked him to walk me through it. He said he turned right from row 20. Dead end. Went back, tried row 18, open, but it curved and spat him out at row 20 again, the same row. He tried going the other direction and ended up back at 20 a third time. I told him to walk straight. He said he had been walking straight. The paths just kept looping him back to the same place, the place where he'd been standing the longest. I asked if he'd been moving fast. He said yes. I asked if after he slowed down, the paths opened up more. He thought about it and said, actually, yeah. When he stopped rushing and walked slowly, he found more passable routes. We added that to the list. Fast movement triggered faster growth response. Slower movement reduced it. Panic was exactly the wrong instinct. We left Greenhouse 4 and stood outside in the sun, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then Marcus said, I think we need to stop going in there. I agreed with him, But the crops were worth several $100,000 in grant funding, and the station director wasn't going to let us abandon them based on what he'd call anecdotal observations. Dana called a meeting that afternoon. The four of us in the break room with the door closed. Ramon had come down from Gainesville specifically because Dana had said it was urgent. She laid out the situation. The greenhouse was becoming unsafe to work in. The growth rate was accelerating. The spatial restructuring was making navigation unpredictable. And we had no mechanism, no explanation, and no institutional support for shutting the project down. Ramon presented his latest route data. The subsurface network now extended at least 30 feet beyond the greenhouse foundation in all directions. It was in the soil under the parking area. It was approaching the foundations of Greenhouse 3, and the deepest roots, the ones 4 feet down, had reached the canal that ran along the south edge of the property. The canal that connected to the drainage system that ran through most of agricultural Homestead. He said it quietly. It's not contained anymore. Dana asked what he thought was happening. Ramon tried to explain it. Something about quorum sensing, bacteria that communicate chemically, plants that might do something similar. He talked for about 2 minutes and then trailed off. He looked at his own data on the screen and said, I keep trying to make this fit something I've read. It doesn't. What he could say was that the root network was acting as some kind of distributed sensing system, detecting us, translating our presence into coordinated growth. What he couldn't say was why, or how it had gotten this sophisticated this fast. I asked him what you'd call an organism that detects another organism's presence and then reorganizes itself to surround that organism. He looked at me and didn't answer. He knew what I was implying. Every biologist knows what that behavior is called, predatory strategy. Marcus said, I'm not going back in there. Dana said, none of us are, not until we know more. That lasted 4 days. What happened next is the part I keep replaying, because it was the moment someone who didn't believe us walked in and learned what we'd been trying to tell them. On July 16th, Heller came to Greenhouse 4 himself. He brought the assistant station director, a woman named Chen who'd been hired 3 months earlier and had never been inside our greenhouses. Heller wanted to see what all the fuss was about. I tried to talk him out of it. I showed him the measurements, the time-lapse footage, the root radar images. He watched for about 3 minutes and then said, Elliot, it's a greenhouse. The plants are growing. That's what they're supposed to do. He told Chen to follow him, and they went in through the north door. Marcus and I stood outside. We could see them through the panels for the first couple minutes. Heller walked with the confidence of a man who'd spent his career in offices and saw the physical world as something that operated according to memos. Chen stayed close behind him. They moved through the center aisle, which had continued narrowing even in the days we'd been staying out, and disappeared into the canopy. They were in there for an hour and 12 minutes. When they came out, Heller's shirt was torn at the shoulder. Chen had scratches on her forearms. Neither of them was speaking. An hour and 12 minutes inside a greenhouse. That's all it took to break a man who'd called us paranoid that morning. Heller walked past us without making eye contact and went to his car and drove away. Chen stopped and looked at me and said, We got lost. I said, I know. She said, We were 20 feet from the door and we couldn't find it. He wouldn't ask for help. We kept turning and every turn was wrong. I asked if she'd noticed the plants moving. She shook her head and then stopped and said, Not moving, but rearranging. After we passed through, the way we came in wasn't the way we could go back. That was the cleanest description anyone had given. The greenhouse didn't move while you watched. It rearranged after you passed. The space behind you became different from the space you'd walked through. Ahead of you, the path looked open. Behind you, it closed. Not fast enough to see, but fast enough to matter. Like being digested by something very slow and very patient. And the worst part, we'd been feeding it. Every day we walked in, we'd been giving it exactly what it needed to get better at this. The next day, we got an email from Heller authorizing a controlled shutdown of Greenhouse 4. All experimental crops to be harvested or destroyed. Timeline: 2 weeks. 2 weeks was too long. We didn't know it yet, but by the time we got that email, the situation had already moved past anything a 2-week timeline could address. On July 18th, I drove to the station early, before sunrise. I don't entirely know why. I'd been sleeping badly. The smell from G4 seemed to follow me home, or maybe I was imagining it. Either way, I was at the station by 5:30 a.m., and the sun wasn't up yet. I walked to Greenhouse 4 to check the exterior. We'd stopped going inside, but I still checked the panels and the ventilation system from outside every morning. Habit, routine, the kind of routine the greenhouse had learned to predict. The polycarbonate panels on the north wall were bowed outward, not cracked, bowed, pressed from the inside by the mass of foliage that had grown against them. In the orange sodium glow of the security lights, I could see the shapes of leaves and stems pressed against the translucent surface like hands against frosted glass. I walked around the perimeter. The south emergency exit, which had been partially obscured by internal growth for weeks, was now visibly blocked from the outside. Green material was pushing through the gaps around the doorframe, not growing through cracks exactly, more like it had expanded to fill every available space, and the door was the weakest point. The east panels had 2 fractures, hairline cracks where something inside had pressed hard enough to stress the polycarbonate. Through the cracks, I could see green, solid, undifferentiated green. No visible aisle space, no open area at all. The greenhouse was full. I need you to understand what that means. 200 feet long, 80 feet wide, 12 feet to the ceiling, every inch of it packed with living plant matter, in less than 2 weeks. I called Dana. She came within the hour. Marcus arrived shortly after. We stood in the parking lot and looked at Greenhouse 4 in the morning light, and nobody said the obvious thing, which was that the building we were looking at no longer had a usable interior. In less than 2 weeks, without human presence inside, the plants had expanded to fill the entire volume. Every aisle, every gap, every cubic foot of airspace that we'd been maintaining through our daily presence had been consumed by growth. And I understood something then that I should have understood weeks earlier. The aisles hadn't stayed open because the plants were allowing us passage. The aisles had stayed open because the plants wanted us to come in. The corridors, the paths, the slowly winding routes that guided our movement deeper and deeper into the greenhouse, those were structures designed to attract and contain. When we stopped entering, the greenhouse didn't need aisles anymore. It filled them in. We'd been thinking about it backwards. We thought the growth was the threat and the open paths were the safety, but the open paths were the trap. The growth was just what happened after the trap closed. And we'd been walking into it every single day for 3 months. Ramon arrived from Gainesville that afternoon. He looked at the greenhouse for a long time without saying anything. Then he walked to the south edge of the property where the drainage canal ran. He had his route scanner with him. He stood there for 10 minutes looking at the water, then knelt down and started scanning the canal bank. When he came back, he was holding a piece of root, thick as his thumb, white, pulled from the soil on the far side of the canal. He didn't say anything at first. He just handed me the scanner screen. I looked at it. Then I looked at the canal. Then I looked at what was on the other side. On the other side of the canal was Benson's nursery, a wholesale plant operation that covered about 40 acres. Tens of thousands of plants in open-air growing fields. We thought it was contained. It had never been contained. We drove over. The nursery looked normal. Rows of potted ornamentals, shade structures, irrigation lines. Nothing unusual to the naked eye. But Ramon had brought his root scanner, and he knelt at the edge of the nursery's nearest field and scanned. The root network from Greenhouse 4 was there, 4 inches below the surface, extending into the nursery, already beginning to interface with the root systems of the nursery's own plants. Ramon said. "It's colonizing." 2 words. He said them like someone reading a diagnosis off a chart. I asked him what that meant in practical terms. He said he didn't know, but the architecture of the invading roots was the same structured lattice pattern he'd documented under G4, the same organized information processing-like pattern. Whatever the root network was doing beneath our greenhouse, it was now doing it beneath a 40-acre commercial nursery full of living plants. And from there, the root system could reach the adjacent properties, the agricultural fields, the drainage network that connected most of the redland. Dana reported it. She called she called the USDA County Extension Office. She called Heller. UF said they'd send someone. USDA said they'd look into it. Heller said to proceed with the shutdown as planned. We started the shutdown on July 20th. It was supposed to be a simple process. Open the greenhouse, cut the plants at the base, bag the biomass, excavate the root material from the raised beds, and dispose of everything through the station's composting system. The first problem was opening the greenhouse. The north door, our primary entrance, was jammed, not locked, jammed. When we pulled the handle, the door moved about 2 inches and then resisted. Through the gap, we could see why. The interior was a wall of green. Stems, leaves, and tendrils had filled the space behind the door so completely that it was like trying to open a door into a closet packed with clothes. We forced it another 6 inches with a pry bar and could feel the mass of vegetation pushing back. We tried the east service entrance. Same thing. The south emergency exit, which had been compromised for weeks, was completely immovable. We tried the west panel access, which was a removable section designed for equipment loading. The bolts came out, but the panel wouldn't budge. Growth behind it had formed a rigid interlocking mat of stems and branches that held the panel in place better than the bolts had. Marcus got a reciprocating saw and we cut through the west panel. It took 40 minutes to get through the polycarbonate and the growth behind it. The saw bogged down repeatedly in the wet, fibrous plant material. When we finally broke through, the opening was about 3 feet square, and beyond it was darkness. The canopy inside was so dense that no light penetrated more than a few inches from the hole. The smell hit us immediately. That same sweet, raw, sap-like scent, but concentrated to a level that made my eyes water. It smelled alive in a way I can't fully describe, not rotten, not decaying, alive, aggressively, oppressively alive. Marcus put his head through the opening and pulled it out again quickly. He said he couldn't see the floor, couldn't see any open space, couldn't see anything except solid plant growth extending in all directions. We didn't go in. Dana called a crew from a local land management company that handled vegetation clearing. They came the next day with brush cutters and machetes and industrial-strength vegetation shears. 3 guys, all experienced in clearing overgrown lots and hurricane debris. They worked for 6 hours. They cleared about 30 feet into the greenhouse from the west opening. In 6 hours, with power tools, they cleared 30 feet. The greenhouse was 200 feet long. Do the math on that. The crew leader told Dana it was the densest growth he'd ever seen. He said it wasn't like cutting through normal plants. The stems were interlocked, woven together, forming structures that resisted cutting because each stem was supported by dozens of others. He compared it to cutting through a wicker basket the size of a building. And he said something else. He said his crew had noticed that the growth behind them, in the areas they'd already cleared, seemed to be regenerating. Not fast enough to see, but when they turned around to bring out a load of cut material, the path they'd cleared seemed narrower than when they'd cut it. I wasn't surprised. They'd been in there for hours. The greenhouse had their scent, their heat, their vibration. It was responding to them the same way it had responded to us. The only difference was that they were cutting it back as fast as it was growing in, and 6 hours in, the greenhouse was winning. The crew didn't come back the next day. The leader called Dana and said he was going to need a hazard assessment before he sent his people in again. He didn't specify what kind of hazard. He just said his guys were unsettled and he wasn't going to push them. 3 grown men with machetes and power tools, unsettled by plants. A year ago, I would have laughed at that. I wasn't laughing now. We were running out of options. The greenhouse couldn't be entered safely. The vegetation couldn't be cleared efficiently. The root network was spreading underground, and the administrative response was still calibrated for a normal agricultural problem, not for whatever Greenhouse 4 had become. On July 23rd, I went to the station before dawn again. I'd barely been sleeping. The notebook next to my bed had pages of measurements and observations and half-formed theories that led nowhere. I drove the dark roads south from Cutler Bay with my windows down and the warm Florida air filling the car, and I felt like I was being pulled rather than driving. Like the station was a gravity well, and I was circling the drain. I parked and walked to Greenhouse 4. The security lights cast their usual orange glow over the property. Everything looked the same from a distance. The greenhouse standing in its usual position, a long, low structure among the other greenhouses, nothing dramatic, nothing visibly wrong from the parking lot. But as I got closer, I saw that the bowed panels on the north wall had cracked further overnight. There were now half a dozen fractures, each leaking a faint tendril of green. Small shoots, no thicker than a pencil, reaching through the cracks into the outside air. In the warm, humid Florida night, they were already 6 inches long. I walked the perimeter again. The east wall had 3 new cracks. The south door frame was now completely hidden behind external growth that had pushed through the gaps and begun climbing the outside surface. And at the west opening where the clearing crew had worked, the cut we'd made had been half filled with new growth overnight. The 30-foot cleared path they'd hacked through the interior was probably gone by now. I stood at the south edge of the property, near the canal. I could see the water reflecting the sky. It looked normal, peaceful even. I looked across to Benson's nursery. Dark at this hour, rows of plants visible as silhouettes. And I noticed something that I had to look at twice before I trusted my eyes. The plants on the near edge of Benson's nursery, the ones closest to the canal, closest to where Ramon had found the invading root network, were leaning, very slightly, not toward the sun, which hadn't risen yet, not toward the wind, which was still, toward me. 40 acres of plants on the other side of a canal, and they knew I was there. I took 3 steps back and watched them. Nothing visible moved. But I had the same feeling I'd had months ago in Greenhouse 4. That feeling of the space being aware of me, of being observed by something that had no eyes but didn't need them. I left. I got in my car and drove home and sat in my kitchen in the dark. I thought about calling someone, but who? The people who needed to know already knew and weren't acting fast enough, and the people who didn't know wouldn't believe me. I went back later that morning after sunrise with Marcus. We were supposed to be preparing documentation for the USDA visit that was scheduled for the following week. But Marcus wanted to check something first. He'd been looking at aerial photos of the property, satellite images pulled from Google Maps. He'd compared an image from March, before any of this started, with a recent one. In March, the station property was a grid. Greenhouses, parking areas, service roads, fields, clean lines, standard agricultural layout. In the recent image, taken sometime in June based on the shadow angles, the vegetation pattern around Greenhouse 4 was different. Not dramatically, you had to look. But the landscaping plants, the grass, the ornamental shrubs along the property fence, all of it had shifted. Grown slightly denser on the side nearest G4, leaning almost imperceptibly toward the greenhouse. It wasn't just the plants inside. The root network was communicating with every plant it reached, and every plant it touched was joining the system. That's the part that keeps me up at night. Not what happened in the greenhouse, what happened after. Marcus zoomed in on Benson's nursery in the recent satellite image. The near edge of their property showed a subtle density gradient. Plants closer to the canal were slightly larger, slightly more lush than plants further away. A botanist might call it a natural moisture gradient from the canal, but we knew better. The last time I went inside Greenhouse 4 was July 25th. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, compulsion. Maybe the same thing that makes people look over the edge of a cliff, that need to see the thing that frightens you from as close as you can stand. I wish I hadn't, because what we found in there is the part I can't forget. Marcus was with me. We reopened the west panel with the pry bar and the reciprocating saw. The growth behind it was fresh and thick and took 20 minutes to cut through. We wore long sleeves and gloves and masks because the air inside was almost unbreathable in its sweetness. We brought flashlights because the interior was nearly dark. We made it about 50 feet in, just 50 feet, in a greenhouse I used to walk end to end in 2 minutes. The growth was a solid mass above, below, and on all sides. We didn't walk through aisles, we cut through tunnels, 1 arm's length at a time, and the cut walls closed behind us almost as fast as we could move forward. The stems were warm to the touch. The leaves brushed against us constantly, a whispering, sliding contact on every exposed surface. I want to be clear about what that means. The way out was disappearing behind us while we moved forward. Every step deeper was a step further from escape. The root network was visible now. The raised beds had been destroyed, absorbed, broken apart by root expansion. The roots were everywhere, covering the floor, climbing the walls, wrapped around the greenhouse frame like veins on an arm. They pulsed very faintly when I put my hand on them. Not a heartbeat, more like the slow contraction of a muscle you didn't know was there. We found one of the time-lapse cameras. It was mounted high on the frame, but the growth had reached it. Stems and tendrils had wrapped around the housing and the lens was covered. The camera was still powered, its red indicator light glowing faintly inside a cocoon of green. Still recording. Recording nothing except the inside of a plant that had swallowed it. Marcus tapped my shoulder. He pointed at the floor ahead of us where the flashlight beam cut through the green. There was a shape in the growth, a depression, an open space surrounded on all sides by dense root lattice. At first I thought it was a random gap, a pocket where the roots hadn't reached yet. But I looked at it longer and the shape registered. Roughly rectangular, about 6 feet by 3 feet. Human-sized. I moved the flashlight. There was another one. And another. 4 open spaces in the root growth, spaced about 8 feet apart. All the same size, all the same shape, as though the greenhouse had prepared stations, positions, places for people to stand. Like something had already figured out where we were supposed to be. I thought about Ramon kneeling in that aisle back in June, the growth closing around him, the equipment being wrapped by stems. The greenhouse hadn't been trying to trap him. It had been making a space for him, a mold, learning his shape. And now it had made 4 of them, 1 for each of us. Marcus saw it too. I know because his flashlight stopped moving. He held the beam on the nearest space for a long time without saying anything. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "We're leaving." His voice was flat and certain, and I didn't argue. We cut our way back out. It took longer than going in because the growth behind us had already begun to fill our tunnel. By the time we reached the opening in the west panel, we were squeezing through a gap barely wide enough for our shoulders. When we stumbled out into the sunlight, both of us were covered in sap and leaf matter, and the sweet smell clung to us like a second skin. I looked back through the opening. It was already shrinking, green tendrils reaching across the gap like fingers closing into a fist. We sealed the opening with sheet metal that afternoon. I didn't go back to the station after that. I called in sick for 2 days and then called Dana and told her I was done. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She said she understood. Her voice on the phone was tired in a way that went past sleep deprivation. She sounded like someone who'd accepted something she didn't have words for yet. Marcus quit the same day. That was 7 months ago. What I'm about to tell you is what happened since. Ramon finished his thesis, He published a paper in a mid-tier journal about anomalous root phenotyping in hybrid Solanum lycopersicum. The paper described the growth patterns in careful, clinical language and stopped well short of the conclusions any of us had actually reached. The abstract mentioned possible novel chemotropic responses and unexplained coordination in root network architecture. The paper got 7 citations in the first year. Nobody followed up. The USDA visited the station in August. They toured the exterior of Greenhouse 4, which by then had multiple panel failures and visible plant mass pushing through every crack and joint. They took soil samples from the surrounding area. They issued a report recommending further study and enhanced monitoring. Further study, enhanced monitoring, that's what they came up with. As far as I know, the greenhouse was never opened again. I drove past the station about 6 months later, just to look. Greenhouse 4 was still standing, but it was unrecognizable. The structure was there, the metal frame and the panels, but it was entirely covered, green on every surface, plants growing through and over and around the building like it was a fallen log in a forest. The surrounding land, the parking area, the fence line, the edge of the canal, all of it was greener than I remembered. Lusher, thicker. Benson's nursery was still operating. I drove past slowly and looked at the rows of potted plants. They looked fine, normal, commercial ornamentals in neat rows, but I noticed the workers staying on certain paths, avoiding certain rows, and the paths they walked had a familiar quality, winding, indirect, longer than they needed to be. I pulled over and watched for 5 minutes. The workers moved through the nursery along the open paths and didn't deviate. The paths curved around certain areas where the growth was denser. The workers didn't look alarmed. They looked accustomed, like they'd always walked that way, like the paths had always been that shape. I thought about the aisles in Greenhouse 4, how they'd opened ahead of us and closed behind us, how we'd followed them without questioning because the open path felt like the safe choice, how we'd been guided deeper into the structure one comfortable step at a time. I watched the nursery workers follow their winding paths, and I wanted to stop. I wanted to get out of my car and shout to them, tell them to look at the routes they were walking, tell them to measure the aisles tomorrow and compare them to today. Tell them to notice how the paths get a little longer every week. But I didn't, because I thought about what would happen if I got out. If I stood on that soil, on that root network, and added my heat and my breath and my presence to the signal. What would grow toward me? How fast it would come? Whether it remembered me? I drove home, took 1 south and then the turnpike north. And the further I got from Homestead, the more the landscape opened up. Concrete and asphalt and development, things that don't grow. And I felt something loosen in my chest. I moved to Gainesville 3 weeks later. Landlocked, no canal connections to the Redland. Concrete everywhere. I took a job at a hardware store. I don't work with plants anymore. But I keep the notebook, and I check the satellite images of Homestead every few weeks. The resolution isn't great, but if you know what to look for, you can see the patterns, the density gradients, the way the vegetation seems thicker in certain areas and thinner in others, following the roads, the paths, the places where people walk and stand and live. It's subtle. You'd never notice if you didn't know what you were looking for. And it's slow. Slower than what happened in Greenhouse 4 because it's spread across a larger area, diluted by distance and competing root systems and the general chaos of a landscape that isn't contained inside a polycarbonate box. But it's organized. The satellite images show it clearly if you overlay them month by month. The vegetation is denser near residential areas, near schools, near the shopping center on Chrome Avenue where people stand in the same spots day after day, waiting for buses, walking to their cars, living their routines. People living their routines, the same way we lived ours inside Greenhouse 4. The root network is still there. Ramon confirmed it before he moved to a position at a university in Utah. The structured lattices, the directional mats, the organized root architecture. It's in the soil under Homestead, growing, mapping, adapting. And the paths are getting longer. I think about those body-shaped spaces in the root growth sometimes, those molds, those stations. I think about what would have happened if we'd stayed. If we'd kept walking those winding paths every day, kept standing in our usual spots, kept feeding the system our heat and our breath and our patterns. Would the aisles have kept narrowing until we couldn't move? Would the roots have risen to the surface, grown up around our ankles, held us in place? Would the canopy have closed over our heads and sealed us in, the way it sealed in the cameras, the way it sealed in the greenhouse itself? I don't know, and I'm not going back to find out. But the last satellite image I pulled up, from 2 weeks ago, showed something that I've been trying not to think about. The vegetation density around Homestead has a pattern to it now. Viewed from above, mapped as a gradient, it looks organized, radiating outward from the area where the station is, following the roads, following the canal network, following the paths that humans made. And at the center, where Greenhouse 4 still stands, covered in green and surrounded by the lush vegetation that's slowly making the whole neighborhood a little thicker, a little denser, a little harder to navigate, the satellite image shows something I can almost convince myself is a coincidence. The growth pattern has a shape. Viewed from above, the density distribution forms concentric rings with channels between them. Rings and channels, like a root cross-section, like the organized lattice Ramon documented beneath the greenhouse floor. Like the whole neighborhood is becoming one structure, one system, one living thing, spreading outward at plant speed, mapping everything that moves through it, opening paths ahead and closing them behind, patient and slow and getting better at it every single day. The paths in Homestead are fine. They're open. People walk them freely. Nothing has changed that anyone would notice. But I check the measurements. Month to month, the paths are getting longer. And I wonder when someone there will notice. And I wonder if, by then, they'll still be able to leave. I think about the greenhouse, about how it learned us, how it built corridors that felt like choices but were really funnels, how the open path was never the safe path. The open path was the invitation. Last week I was walking through my neighborhood in Gainesville. A quiet street, live oaks overhead, Spanish moss, typical North Florida. I walked my usual route, the one I walk every evening, same sidewalks, same turns. And I noticed for the first time that the hedges along one stretch of sidewalk seemed a little closer than I remembered. I stood there for a moment, then I walked a different way home. The next morning, I went back to that stretch of sidewalk, told myself I was being paranoid,